Thank you very much. Oh, God, that's loud. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Making VR Comfortable Developers Perspective panel at EGX Rezzed 2019. I'm Callum Hurley, brand ambassador for Oculus, VR specialist at IPG Esports. And joining me are three fantastic developers, and I'll hand you over to them to introduce themselves and what they do.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Sam Watts, and I'm Director of Immersive Technologies for a company called Make Real. We released Radial-G a number of years ago, one of the first games on Oculus Rift and HTC Vive, and then PlayStation VR. And then our second game, Mario Party in VR, essentially Loco Dojo, came out a couple of years ago. One's very fast and very stomach-turning, so I guess I'm pretty good to talk about comfort.
I'm Katie Goode, Creative Director of Triangular Pixels. We're a VR game studio based down in Cornwall. And we're best known for our first game, which is Unseen Diplomacy, which is a launch game for the HTC Vive. Good to see some people nodding their heads there, it's good. And then our second game was Smash It Plunder for PSVR, and we're currently working for a sequel for Unseen Diplomacy.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah. I graduated last year in computer science. I did my dissertation on a VR project, which is now transformed into my VR startup, which I'm doing in my free time. And in my full-time job, I'm doing software development at Deutsche Bank.
Fantastic, and thank you very much to the three of you for joining me, and thank you everyone in the audience for being with us today. So VR, I'm sure, as many of you were, sort of made a resurgence in 2012 with the Oculus Rift, and since then, developers and engineers have ushered in a whole new genre of gaming. For years, there have been some sizable barriers to entry for VR, though. One of the biggest for a lot of people is nausea and motion sickness in the early days. But now in 2019, this has become less of an issue and almost a non-issue for many people, thanks to various development techniques implemented by new software, forward-thinking developers like our panelists here. But that's enough from me. We'll hear from the panelists that you're actually here to listen to. So to start off, for those who may be unfamiliar, what are some of the leading causes of discomfort in VR, particularly early on during like the Oculus DK1 days?
Did you get to try a DK1?
Sorry?
Did you get to try a DK1?
I haven't, no.
You haven't had a chance yet?
No.
But I remember those days very, unfortunately, clearly. So, I mean, really early on, it really came down to the fact that, you know, when you get like that sort of really drunk feeling, and then you move, and then your sight sort of catches up with you. That was basically what the DK1 was. It sort of just wasn't there in terms of how quick it could refresh a screen. But when we started getting positional tracking for the heads and the hardware started coming on, like it moved from basically like problems with the hardware to things like if us as game developers were forcing like forces inside the game world on you that weren't happening in real life, and so you had this like mismatch of your balance. That's when like things started really going wrong. I think one of the other ones as well, which I think you might have found out with Radial-G, is actually having like things moving past your eyesight really, really quickly. So when you're sitting on the train and you're looking outside and your eyes are doing that sort of weird twitchy movement, that can also make you feel really uncomfortable.
Yeah, there's the main thing is like down to it's just hereditary. So if there's a disconnect between what your eyes and your ears are telling your brain or your inner ear in terms of motion and not moving, but also being told visually you're moving, there's a connection still between our inner ear and our gut. So it's about being poisoned. So your body says, I've been poisoned, I must puke, get it out of me. Therefore, that's what sort of VR replicates. And then with the lack of the head movement, you know, we are constantly moving our head tiny little fractions of amount, even when we think our head is perfectly still. And with the early headsets, the DK1, 3 degrees of freedom, that was not being correlated to what you were seeing as well. But then in terms of peripheral vision, our eyes update much quicker at higher frequency in a peripheral vision because, you know, we can see prey coming and know when we're about to be attacked and stuff like that. But the screens, you know, they all operate at the same frequency, so they can't replicate that. So the earlier screens were 60 hertz. PSVR goes up to 120 now. 90 is sort of standard everywhere else. Rift S is going back down to 80, but as long as it's over 60, it's generally comfortable.
Yeah. And how much would you say, particularly with headsets like pictured up here, the Oculus Go, while obviously the tech has moved on a little bit since the DK1, that in particular is still a 3 degrees of freedom headset. Does that make developing comfortable games for a 3DOF headset like the Oculus Go a little more difficult than when working with Rift, Vive, PSVR?
We don't make games for the Oculus Go, we only go full VR.
We don't make games with Oculus Go.
Ooh.
I do.
Hey.
So I'm developing for the Oculus Go at the moment. So the reason why is because my demographic is actually seniors with dementia. So it's definitely not gamers, definitely a demographic which is not familiar with the gaming world, as people in younger generations would be. So I have to make sure comfort is my priority. And it's quite a scary technology for them as it is, let alone, and putting on this giant headset. They're scared of phones sometimes, so let alone this. But a big consideration for me is locomotion. So I have to make sure that when they're traveling around this world, that I'm not causing any sickness. And the reason, so what I've done with the Oculus Go is obviously they can't physically move around. It's only 3 degrees of freedom, but what I do is I make sure that I have hotspots which snap to that location instead of cascading them towards that, because obviously the processing power of the Oculus Go isn't as amazing as the Rift, so I have to compensate for that. And what I do is, acceleration is a big problem, as you would know, with motion sickness, so snapping is a big part of it, because I really don't want to make old people feel sick. But yeah, that's a big consideration of mine. But I don't think it's easier or harder. It's having to compensate for the low processing power, which is a bit of a challenge when it comes to importing 3D assets. But apart from that, I don't think there's a huge difference, really.
I feel like, though, so it does depend on the title. So with Unseen Diplomacy, there's no locomotion at all. But we allow players to move themselves around the world and change the world around them. So they are moving throughout the world, but because of the visual tracking, we can get away with not doing any sort of locomotion. So I feel like having, especially when it comes to inside-out tracking that's coming along, and you're going to be having much larger tracking spaces as well. It's the new lighthouses can track warehouse scale. I think that's going to start allowing for much more location-based, sort of really big-scale VR. So I'm hoping that is another way that we can get around the whole locomotion making people sick problem, is much more experiences like Unseen Diplomacy, where it is just people moving themselves around now.
Not very good for the home user, though, because we can't clear out our entirety of our homes for VR, as much as we'd love to, but...
Yes, of course. In fact, talking about that, though, have you noticed negative effects on the perception of VR, particularly with gamers, consumers who have yet to jump in?
We've definitely experienced this firsthand, people's feedback with VR, when we've shown at events like this. We've been showing off Unseen Diplomacy or Smash Hit Plunder, and we've got loads of extra comfort options in there, or we don't have to have them. And we've had players refuse to try it because they've said, "Oh, I've tried VR. I tried cardboard, and I had my phone in there, and then they talk about the roller coaster experience they had and how it made them feel sick." And I'm just it's so hard to communicate the fact that maybe that hardware wasn't quite the same as this 800 quid device, and also the fact that the actual software itself can make them feel ill, and it's so hard to communicate that in a passing moment. So yeah, that's why I'm interested to see what Nintendo Labo does with their new VR thing, because I got this horrible feeling it's going to be similar.
My general response is I tried VR, didn't like it, and it's what do you say that same about TV? VR is a medium, it's a new platform. There's hundreds of different experiences and types of experience. Just because you've tried one, probably on a cardboard, probably quite a crappy roller coaster, probably felt a bit ill, doesn't mean that you should discard the rest of the hardware and the technology.
As you said, the cardboard, frustratingly, doesn't do it justice in VR. And I went to a few hackathons early on when I was at university, and they had like a cardboard there, and that's when I first tried VR. And at the time, I really didn't think it was a big deal. I wasn't really too amazed, but it was only until I put on a Gear VR, and then I tried on Oculus Rift, which I realized actually VR has a lot more potential. So yeah, it is a bit annoying that people, in my network, they think that VR is, on the phone, and that's all it is. So I have had that problem of I have to sort of, when I show them my Rift, and I show them a really cool game, like Superhot, that's when they realize, actually, this is amazing. And sort of to go beyond that as well, as I said, my demographic is older people, which is even harder. But I've actually found, doing a bit of research, is that people around the age of 30 to 50, I would say, are a lot more averse to their technology. But around 60 to 70, they're actually a lot more open to it, because, I don't know why. They're actually very open to it. The only thing is that I once tried to put the Oculus Go on my great-grandmother, and her first problem was ruining her hair. So this is something to be aware of. The hardware itself, not just the software, it has to be very comfortable for them, and they're a little bit more averse to hardware, but I suppose the software itself, they're actually quite okay with. But.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not so much people's perception of nausea and VR. For us, it's more just every time VR is mentioned in the media, it's like, it made me feel sick, or making a joke about, you might puke, da, da, da. And it's just like constant references. Every time there's VR mentioned in an article, there's always a reference to nausea. And we found at events, especially, if we used to have a sign up saying, if you feel unwell, stop, take the headset off, don't push through it. It's not a challenge, no one's going to think you're soft or anything. But we then also discovered not a placebo, but a nocebo effect. So it's basically planting a negative thought in somebody's head. If they think, go, VR might make me feel ill, and then they start to feel ill because they're thinking that and expecting it. So we just generally are very diligent when we're demoing and keeping an eye on people and just looking out for the clear signs of people obviously maybe not having a good time within the headset. But then it's been a few years since I've demoed Radial-G, but we tracked less than 1% of people feeling ill, and I've never seen anybody actually ill.
Before we discuss solutions that were implemented, at what point during the development process of a game, project, or experience did you first realize that you were really going to need to work on making your games more comfortable? At what point did that become a focus?
I've started in VR and AR 2012, so this is super early on, before some of this stuff was even announced. So we were trying out concepts of sitting on top of a dragon and flying around and going, this feels amazing, but at the same time, I don't know if I can stay in it. I was at Sony at the time as well, so we were very aware of we need to make sure that people can actually play this stuff. And this is when I started actually researching into human biology to figure out what's going on. So we realized, I guess, at that point, I realized that when coming out of a game, it needs to be in very concept stages. You need to think about how you're going to be moving people around, maybe giving them a context of why they can teleport or something. Because otherwise, if you try and sort of hack it in later on, first of all, you can tell it's a hack, and it sort of can break your immersion really easily.
Yeah, I think the same with, the first thing we made in 2013, or started to make, was Radial-G on the DK1. And we had a tube you could spin around and race around. And it was well, this is comfortable, this is fine. And then we started putting actual objects and the level in. And then suddenly it was just the whole world's spinning. This isn't very comfortable. And we had to then sort of do a lot of work to improve that. But now, comfort is key. The three main elements of what makes a good VR experience, with immersion through the technology, presence through the psychological sense of being somewhere else. You can't get either of those if the people aren't comfortable.
For myself, I think I've had to put comfort as my first step, really, because of the nature of my startup. Because when I'm sort of trying to communicate this, the value of my startup to investors or potential stakeholders or people testing it, their first question is whether old people can really tolerate this technology. So that's when I thought, okay, so I've got to take into account the hardware. Is this going to be super bulky? So I had to do extensive research onto what hard sets would be best to use for them, but also the software as well. So I have to make sure that when I demo my prototype to potential investors, as I said, it does look good, because otherwise they're not going to buy into it. So that was quite an easy way of me to see that comfort is important before any actual clinical trials or research was done. So yeah, I've been in a different position in that it's just had to be my first priority, from the beginning.
I see. And I'm curious to know, especially, so the two of you, as you mentioned, you started working with VR quite early on into its resurgence, whereas Hannah a little later So I'm curious of the differences between how easy it was to work on comfort solutions for your software, because obviously I presume early on you had to do a lot of the work on your own because there wasn't a lot of info out there to work from. I'm curious how much that's changed and how much info there is out there now to learn from and work from.
Well, to start off with, there was a big learning curve of, we need to, what can we do to make things comfortable? We need to ensure people are comfortable at all times. And then when it got to a certain point, especially with VR games and players, the usual hardcore mentality came through, and it was like, I don't want comfort, I want full locomotion, I want to be able to run around, I don't care about the right stick of poison, I want, an FPS, and I don't care if I'm going to feel sick, I'll get through it, I'll develop VR legs or whatever. And now it's kind of gone back the other way, so there's a lot of games out there today being released that wouldn't have got through comfort review a while ago, but it's more about accessibility to ensure that you've got a variety of levels of comfort options. So if people want to take the stabilizers off and go mad, they can. But if they want snap turning, or if they want teleportation, or if they want some kind of zoom to movement to make it comfortable so they can play for longer, then that's fine as well. But it all just comes down to budget and time and effort. But when we started out, the tool sets are fairly robust and stable now. Unity wasn't really fully, the SDK was constantly changing, the Oculus SDK was constantly changing, the Morpheus, what became the PlayStation VR SDK, was a mess for ages. And we were fighting against the tools as well as the technology.
Well, I feel pretty lucky now because I didn't have any of those problems, actually. I think I entered the space a year, probably near 2 years now, as I said, for my university dissertation. I hadn't had any experience in VR development throughout my degree, but I had done plenty of development. I had learned C# already, so it was quite easy for me to start developing in Unity. But then in terms of the hardware that was out there as well, I started with the Gear VR, and the Oculus Go was, I think it was coming out at that time. I'm pretty sure it was, actually I think it was already out. It was like the very early stage of it anyway. So yeah, I mean, and the Rift was out as well. But yeah, I've been quite lucky, I suppose, in that I'm entering it now, because the hardware was already quite advanced and quite easy for me to work with.
I think it's very different now as well, because you've got toolkits out there. You've got VR TK, you've got even like the Steam VR tool set basically has all these features built in to some extent, or at least some basic ones. So it's got you can literally just drop in a few prefabs into Unity and you've got teleportation, whereas we had to write that stuff ourselves. So it's much easier for people now to get going with comfort, unlike the oldie times.
There's also, I can't remember what it's called now, VR tunneling kit.
Yeah.
Made by, I've forgotten their name.
It's based on the Ubisoft stuff. Yeah. I mean, we're all learning from each other. We're always, there's been conferences, VR conferences from day dot. So, I mean, we've been up on stage many times, like, basically talking through with other developers, like, all these different problems and these different solutions.
Yeah. But, hardware is always evolving and there's always new headsets coming out. So don't worry, you will get to wrestle with a new specific hardware runtime at some point. The Quest isn't finalised yet, so...
And so a lot of issues obviously have improved over time on the hardware side, as we mentioned, introducing 6 degrees of freedom, etc. And thanks to introducing low latency OLED displays, high refresh rate. So Comfort VR is sort of an all-time high at the moment compared to where it has been previously. But it's obviously still not perfect. So I'd love, if possible, if you could talk through a few of the specific techniques you did implement into your games to make them a little more comfortable.
Well, you can freely walk around in your game. It's very comfortable.
Yeah, so, I mean, for Unseen Diplomacy, basically, players literally walk themselves around. They've got this 3x4 meter space they can walk in, well, for Unseen Diplomacy 1 anyway. And so they walk through a door, we load out the room that was behind them, and when they go through the next door, we load in a different room. And so basically, they're basically walking around in circles and walking in on themselves all the time. Humans are terrible at figuring out where they've been. Like, we recognize where we've been through our eyesight a lot, rather than like how many meters we've moved. So you get completely like lost and immersed in the world in a good way. So we literally just. We just rely on that. But for like when we had to move to PSVR, we didn't have that tracking space, and that's where we had to rely on much more traditional techniques. So we had different ones, like, because people get sick in different ways. There are 2 different ways I mentioned about having that difference between acceleration and then that also like that visual movement. So we had the ability to switch on different things. So one of them was you point to where you want to go to in the game and you tap and you either locomote smoothly to that point or you teleport in small little steps, and you've got a visual comfort thing of changing the field of view. So you basically look like you're looking through binoculars if you want to, which reduces all that visual movement. And then there's also like turning on this fog mode, which basically brings up like this dark fog. So it sort of reduces the contrast. So it makes you feel like you're not moving at all. So, I mean, going from like a game where there was like nothing because we didn't need it to needing to put in all these extras is sort of like, it's quite different.
Yeah, I mean, there's no hard and fast rule set that's going to make any VR experience comfortable for everyone. And we're never going to get to a point where VR is going to be comfortable for 100% of the people who try it anyway. A lot of what we had to integrate and come up with for Radial-G was, very specific to that game, because we were throwing people down a tube in space at very high speeds, allowing them to rotate 360 degrees around it. But then space gave us a lot of sort of natural comfort options anyway, because there's no horizon, so they can't necessarily, you're not sat on a ship, as it were, in a spaceship. But and the fact that you're constantly looking at the track, and essentially it's the track that's rotating in front of you, as opposed to the whole world, the rest of the world is. But it was just generally more comfortable because it gives you these fixture points. We thought we'd done a lot, but then we put the game onto Sony PlayStation VR, and then they had an actual proper comfort review. Then unless it gets past that, it will never get on the console. And we thought we'd done a lot until we got to that stage, and then we had to start doing a whole lot more. But we essentially did the same thing as what you did with a binocular view, but because it was Wipeout-esque futuristic ships, there's not a lot of cockpit and there's quite a lot of peripheral movement of the track, so we just had to add more geometry to sort of essentially cut all that viewpoint off. Wipeout did that 6-9 months after us. So
yeah, and Wipeout is actually remarkably comfortable more so than
Annoyingly
I
so.
expected. And so I'm curious, more recently now, how it's been implementing your own comfort techniques, how easy that's been, how difficult that's been. Obviously now, as software development kits have moved on a little bit, was there anything built into, whether you're using Unity, Unreal, is there anything built in that helps you a little bit nowadays?
To help me with the comfort side of things.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, I'm still in the learning stages, and comfort is something that, because I don't really know how my users will feel. I've only tested my experience on a few people, so only until we have a full-on clinical trial will we actually know how seniors feel about it. So I actually haven't experienced too much about things that help me. It'd be good to learn from you too, actually.
I guess so I know that using teleporting, for example, we, as gameplay designers, would actually stay away from teleporting as much as possible, because it can be disorientating and can be immersion breaking, which is fine if you're doing like quite a sedate experience, or you're doing like maybe something which is like a training exercise or something, rather than a gameplay. But like in gameplay, I mean, you can teleport if you're doing a platformer and you can teleport anywhere. Suddenly you lose all the gameplay. Like I just teleport up to that point rather than having to jump around. And I have seen someone doing that sort of game, and I go, well, what's the point if you can teleport? So yeah, as you say, so it very much sort of depends on the game. So yeah, we try and stay away from that one.
Well, I mean, also comfort is first and foremost. It's down to performance and optimization of your code base and your engine. Unity, the Unreal these days, they've got a lot of single pass rendering and foveated rendering and various other tips and techniques to ensure that the graphics card is having to do less, or CPU's having to do less work, so that you can ensure that you're going to hit a certain frame rate. I know people like to build Ninja PCs, and they can run an FPS at over 120 frames per second, or locked to their 144 hertz monitor, etc. But traditional, what we would call pancake games on displays, it doesn't really matter if the frame rate drops. It just slightly detriments your experience, and shows that maybe you need to upgrade your PC or whatever. For us, dropping a frame is kind of like the worst thing in the world, and we have to ensure that we're running at 72 hertz if it's Oculus Go, 75 hertz if it's Quest, 80 or 90 if it's Rift or Rift S, 90 if it's Vive, up to 120 if it's PSVR. And there are tools in the runtimes that do predictive frame buffering, asynchronous time warp, etc. With the Oculus side is probably the best example, which means that people with slightly lower end PCs can still essentially get a 90 hertz experience, but then you get a weird sort of artifacts and stuff appearing. Our background is simulation and training and full flight simulators, so we're generally quite used to having a very picky client base. And we always go for, our constant main concern is hitting 90 always, and anything that we add to the game need to ensure it's optimized within an inch of its life to make sure that isn't affected.
I guess also if you're launching on PSVR, Sony just won't let you out if you're running below frame rate. It's like just won't let you launch, because their number one priority is the fun, enjoyment, and making sure they don't make their own players feel sick. So we were launching Smash It Plunder on PSVR. We had this extra benefit of, so talking about performance, obviously for VR games, you're never going to see like the shiniest, newest graphics, because you're having to render everything twice, once for each eye. We were also doing a local multiplayer game so people can join in on the TV, which means there was another camera. So we had like 3 cameras minimum compared to everybody else. So we had to do some real hackery with what we were rendering on the screens, making sure we were rendering as little as possible all the time, etc. But one of the things we ended up doing was actually having like adaptive frame rate, but for just the TV screen. So if the PSVR or the PS4 detects the fact that the frame rate is going to start dropping for the for the VR player, it will actually drop the frame rate on the TV and not render it as many times, render it every other frame or something, so that the VR player can always have a fun experience, like, you know, not puke experience. And to be honest, like the TV player doesn't really notice, but when you are in VR and moving your head around, you damn well notice.
As both of you have launched PSVR games, firstly, were they running at 120 or were they running at 60 with reprojection?
Ours was 60 at reprojection. There was no chance we could do ours at 120. We've got dynamic objects all over the place. You can smash everything up. You can spawn loads of loot. It's like, no, 60.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't any slight to Unreal or Unity, but I severely doubt any of the games doing 120 native are built in those engines.
Yes, yeah.
I'd imagine it's all native. But yeah, we were 60 reprojected to 120.
And I'm curious if you could explain, if just some of the people here are unaware, what that means, reprojection, games running at 60 FPS on PSVR.
I guess the kind of nearest, easiest concept is the fact that when you get a 720p old DVD and you put it in your shiny 1080p TV, it doubles all the pixels to sort of upscale it. It's kind of that, but for frames. So it's double buffering all the frames to run at to get to the native 120 hertz operating of the headset. But then you have to be really careful because you've got a visual update, but also your physics update.
Yes.
So your physics will be updating at a different frequency anyway, depending upon whether it's single player, multiplayer, online over the internet, local multiplayer, etc., PlayStation, PC. You have to remember the PlayStation is like 8 Intel Atom cores strapped together, so there's not a lot there to really play with, and it was probably never really designed for PSVR. So yeah, I mean, PS Pro's a bit more headroom, but yeah, sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that's fine.
What is reprojection?
Well, essentially, I was just leading towards wondering if that made any difference comfort level wise with a native, sort of 90 hertz, 90 frames a second PC headset. Did you notice more of a difference when running 60 frames a second on PS4?
So we were doing lots of performance tests and switching between the three. So like we can dynamically switch between 60, 90, and 120. And like you can, like for some reason running at 90, like even though like we were running at 60, like it didn't feel quite as nice as just letting it run at 60 and go up to 120. And it's really hard to describe because it's so slight. Like we couldn't go into like a heavy scene where there was lots of smashed objects and run at 90 anyway. But like even just like walking around, I don't know. It's as soon as you start running at higher frame rate, so 120 or reprojected up to 120, it just feels so much more lifelike. And I think that was actually the complaint that The Hobbit had. Like if people watch the higher frame rate version of The Hobbit, they're like, oh, it doesn't feel like a film anymore, and it just sort of looks too real. Well, that's a good thing for VR. So if we can all next generations somehow all go up, like if we can keep that high frame rate, then that'd be awesome.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you get a 4K TV and by default out of the box it has all the true motion smoothing, super accelerated stuff turned on, and everything looks like a soap opera, and it's got like only 3 planes of existence, and then once you turn all that crap off, then it feels a bit more normal. It's kind of like that, but in reverse.
Okay, so of course, as developers working in VR, a lot of the time you're playing those less polished builds, you're testing. Obviously, I presume anyway, it must be hard to judge comfort level entirely by yourself, because obviously everyone is so different and reacts so differently. How do you sort of get the best feel for what will work for the most amount of people? How many people do you test that with?
We have a basement full of people who aren't allowed out and are never allowed to try any other VR. So we just get a fresh one out and it's like, right, this is your first VR experience. How do you cope? No, I mean, in all seriousness, 8 out of 10 people probably still haven't tried VR. So it's easy to do a user test and get people in off the street with the lure of beer and pizza to try something out. and more than likely it's going to be their first VR experience, so you can really see how your comfort efforts are going.
I find that VR legs in general is just entirely bullshit. So my other half, he has always just got so sick. Like he barely plays many VR games just because of that, even the most popular ones. So he's generally a good test case, and he's the one that's actually programming the stuff. And like, it also depends, like, if you've got a cold or something, that also can affect your balance and affect how you feel. But ultimately, like, coming to events like this is the best way to really test. And that's where we found out, like, something wasn't working. Like, where we were showing Smash It Plunder on the Gear VR originally, and someone clicked to go somewhere, we knew that something wasn't right, because every time they clicked to move forward, everybody would rock backwards slightly, because they're expecting that acceleration. And so we changed up a few things, and now when people click to go somewhere, they don't do that rocking action anymore. And that wasn't necessarily people telling us they felt ill, that was just literally watching people move. And we wouldn't have got that without going to events like this.
Well, the natural fact is that you can't please everyone, I've learned. And it's all about finding that balance between the people who feel really sick after 5 minutes in VR versus the VR veterans. And there was a guy who spent like a week in VR, and he lost a little bit of, understanding of the world, I guess, for a little bit. But like people like that, like they can tolerate it. But yeah, it's just about finding that balance and knowing, and I have a mobile experience with my Oculus Go, so I normally carry about my experience so I can just test it on people and to get feedback as much as I can, because it's really easy just to get my super light Oculus Go and just say, hey, do you want to give it a go? And people are normally very open to trying it out, and that's really valuable feedback for me. And 70% of the time, people are okay with it. Nobody's worried about feeling sick. Some people at first are like, they're trying to move about and jump. It's like, no, you can't do that. But I think it's only until the headsets are actually ubiquitous in households and when it becomes very accessible and cheap, will people really actually be very comfortable with the whole technology.
And I'm curious, actually, in your specific case, in regards to the nature of your startup, is there a difference when you've got a new piece of software? Is there a difference often in reaction when testing with, for instance, someone who is suffering dementia and someone who isn't? Is there a difference in the comfort level they experience?
Actually, it's quite interesting. With seniors who don't have dementia, they are a bit more averse because they have an awareness of their surroundings. They know technology, and they've heard maybe heard of virtual reality. I mean, they're actually a little bit more averse to it as opposed to people with dementia, because people with dementia are a little bit more curious about the world around them, and it's interesting, like the fact that they're a lot more open to it. In terms of comfort, it's pretty much the same, really. From my experience, I've found that sort of both demographics, but seniors with or without dementia, there's no there's no difference between whether they feel motion sickness or not.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've been working, we have a blind veteran centre just outside Brighton, and I've been doing technology demonstrations there. So bear with me, putting blind people in VR is the most amazing thing in the world. And obviously there's a range of blindness. Some are entirely blind, but still the binaural audio works. The first time I did it was with a Vive that was still tethered, and I did the Blue, so it's a simple short sequence. You're on a shipwreck under the sea, there's fish different sizes, and then a whacking great whale comes along. And I didn't think it was going to work. Blind people, VR, need eyes, etc. But people, they could actually see, because how they were working with the VR technology, or how their eyes were working, is different to how your eyes operate in the real world. Yeah. So if they had convergence issues in the real world, they because they were staring at infinity through the screen, and because of the magnification of the lenses and everything, they could actually see the content, and then they were getting up, which is terrifying, and chasing fish around. Wow. And I was like, right, okay. So I went back with the Vive Pro. It has a higher resolution, and then the wireless adapter. Right, no cables, better health and safety. And yeah, they're being guided over. They couldn't see in the real world. They had to be guided to where the seat was and sort of feeling it to sit down. Put the headset on, and that's it. They're off. It was absolutely astounding. And just now trying to find a way of using the pass-through if it can actually help them see properly
the real world,
normally. So
that's incredible. As software developers, is there anything you guys are really clamoring to see improve on the hardware side that you'd really like to be a focus in the future, just to make your jobs easier?
Release it in more colours other than black.
Grey.
We've got a silver one right here.
Yeah, and you'll find it a lot easier to get that on people's heads than a black headset.
We ended up putting googly eyes and stuff on the front of our Gear VR because the approachability of the headset, especially for non-gamers, is this is really scary. As soon as you put googly eyes on something, they don't really mind. But I find that I've been looking at a lot of accessibility at the moment. So because VR is very physical. There's a lot of people that don't have that physical ability. There's also a social economic problem I found. VR headsets are expensive, especially the good ones. People might slate the Oculus S because of its stats, but I'm quite looking forward to when technology goes on so much that actually good headsets are cheap. That's a bit of technology I'm looking forward to. It's so that's the point where that's going to make our lives easier because suddenly it's going to get much easier to get funding for stuff because everyone's got a headset and people are making a lot of money from VR content.
Well, for myself, obviously, the Oculus Go is quite a lightweight headset for seniors. What would be more ideal is to be less sort of chunky and actually even lighter would be great. Especially so sometimes when I test it, I have to get rid of the top strap and the side strap. They just want to hold the headset on their head because they're much more comfortable with that. But what would be really nice is to have it a lot more lightweight and less. It's kind of intimidating looking to some people. So that would be great. As you said as well, when they're actually cheaper, that's what I'm excited for because right now the good headsets, they are expensive and it creates a barrier for entry for people who want to learn virtual reality development. I was quite lucky in that I did it for my university dissertation, which meant my university was able to fund just my Gear VR. And later on, I found some more funding, and I was able to buy some headsets like this. But yeah, they do need to be cheaper though, because there's a rising demand for VR developers, and that can only really be met if headsets are cheaper and people can learn with them. So, yeah.
They have to be cheaper and good, not cheaper like cardboard.
And so just lastly, what would your advice be to any developers looking to dip their toes into VR development? Anything that just you think is important to know that maybe information isn't as widespread as it should be? Just anything you'd advise?
So I guess my pro tip is there is a lot already out there. There's a lot of videos of all the talks that we've done, all the panels that we've done. So you're not starting from afresh now. You've got a really big advantage over what we had, so you can get going much quicker. So do listen to those people, but again, test stuff out for yourself. Take it with a pinch of salt, because some of the information might be quite outdated. Some people, it is all just our opinion at the end of the day. This is we've got a lot of experience, but it's still just opinion on stuff. So try out stuff and watch stuff, basically.
Yeah, you can get a free copy of Unity or Unreal. You can make a 3D scene. You can download assets for free off TurboSquid or whatever. You can chuck stuff in. You can throw a virtual camera of the Oculus SDK into the scene, and it will work in VR. It's really easy. What is the difficult bit is actually designing it so it's comfortable or so it performs properly, optimizing. But we've mentioned it already, VRTK is probably your best starting point for Unity. And there's hundreds of tutorials out there. And it's all about experimentation. And then you learn very quickly all the things you want to do, and it's all then, like anything else, limited by budget. And all these lovely comfort options take time to implement, and you probably can't afford to do it.
So as they said, a lot of tutorials online. I'm self-taught. I obviously learned how to do development at university, but You don't have to be an amazing developer to get started. You can just throw a bunch of models in a scene, and then you're good to go. But the sources that I learned to improve my skills in VR were from the likes of Coursera, Udemy, and EGX. And there are a lot more developers willing to reach out a helping hand if you ever need it online. So get into the community on Reddit or Twitter, and that's that was really helpful for me.
Don't go on Reddit. Don't go on VR Reddit. There's also VR Dev Slack as well, so there's all split into channels for all different platforms, and there's multitudes of developers out there doing it, making it, willing to answer questions, and there's a lot of questions pinned and stuff. So.
Fantastic, and we've just about hit time. So lastly, for anyone looking to keep an update with you guys and what you guys are doing, where can they find you?
Twitter mostly, not on Reddit. VR_Sam.
My Twitter is KT_tripixels.
Find me on Twitter, really, or on my website if you want to know more, hannahblair.co.uk.
Fantastic. Well, thank you guys so much for being here today, and thank you guys so much in the audience for coming and listening. I hope you've learned a little bit today. Thank you very much, guys.